Good morning. I am Chaplain Audrey Carnegie. We're going to try something a little bit different this morning, more of a conversation over the lesson between Robert and I. So this week's lesson continues the study of Corinthians, and it looks at two different familiar metaphors in Scripture, farming and building, to address this problem of church leadership, especially when it becomes between leaders who are rivals.
Yes, we all have ways of doing things. Audrey, I think you remember our first year of summer camp down at Pine Lake Fellowship Camp. We were new directors, and we were coming in with another way of doing things, what we knew. And it was different from what they knew.
Yeah, we soon found that out. Yeah. And most of the counselors, adapted pretty smoothly to that, but there was that one who so often would come to us and that's not the way so-and-so did things. And, the other way was always better.
Yeah. Well, do you think that comparison and quarrelings were part of the Corinthians fighting faction? We see Apollos says that it was, says it this way, and then Paul would say it another way. In the text today, Paul uses farming and building as metaphors to help them think of them being partners and not competitors.
So, depending on the view from the windows here at Landis Homes, perhaps people are beginning to see some new construction on campus. It's finally moved from getting all the foundations ready, and the structures are starting to go up. So I'm thinking they had to change a few things about how they did this, how they do this.
So, in any construction project, there are different tools, equipment, skills of each stage of construction. They had to move a lot of rocks over there, and they brought in a stone, something to crush the stones, so they could get rid of the stones and then actually reuse those for part of the erosion control and foundation. Different tools and skills are needed in the framing process, in the electrical process, in the plumbing process, putting up drywall, etc. And although these different trades are different, different tools, etc., and so on, there's also one purpose and one plan. And they're following these plans in order to make a house that is able to be lived in.
Right, yeah. So farming is the other example Paul uses. And it kind of works the same way. In our household, you plow the garden and I plant it, and you set up the watering system and I get to weed. Neither of us, though, is in charge of photosynthesis or generation of the seeds. That whole thing is part of the mystery of growth, and it's God's business. So at the end of the day, everything we raise, the fruit of our labor, is God's good gift to us.
Yeah, I might weed once in a while, but... last week we read in the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul addresses their immature behavior as they give in to quarreling and jealousy between these factions. So as we read the text for today, listen for Paul's use of these two metaphors to encourage the church to find their way to unity as they work towards a common purpose.
So 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 to 23. After all, what is Apollos? What is Paul? They are servants who helped you to believe. Each one had a role given to them by God. I planted, Apollos watered, but God made it grow. Because of this, neither one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but the only one who is anything is God who makes it grow.
And the one who plants and the one who waters work together, but each one will receive their own reward for their own labor. We are God's co-workers, and you are God's field, God's building.
I laid a foundation with a wise master builder. according to God's grace that was given to me, but someone else is building on top of it. Each person needs to pay attention to the way they build it. No one can lay any foundation other than the foundation that is already laid in Christ Jesus.
So whether someone builds on top of the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, grass, or hay, each one will be clearly shown. The day will make it clear because it will be revealed with fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work survives, they'll get a reward.
But if anyone's work goes up in flames, they'll lose it. However, they themselves will be saved as if they had gone through a fire. Don't you know that you are God's temple, and God's Spirit lives in you? If someone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, because God's temple is holy, which is what you are.
Don't fool yourself. If some of you think that they are worldly, wise, then they should become foolish so that they become wise. This world's wisdom is foolishness to God. As it is written, he catches the wise in their cleverness. And also, the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are silly.
So then, no one should brag about human beings. Everything belongs to you. Paul, Apollos, Cephas, the world, life, death, things in the present, things in the future, everything belongs to you. But you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. So the writer here is beginning with a good reminder, as the writer of the lesson wants us to remember a little bit about who Paul's audience is, who he's writing to. So Paul's talking to a church plant in a culture where Christianity is an entirely new thing. Also, they're recent converts. So thinking and living in the way of Jesus as opposed to all of these cultural values, it was a challenge. And one of those cultural values was the ability to speak well and polished. It was called rhetoric. And Apollos is a shining example of what they valued, that rhetoric. So Paul here is urging all those factions to see each other as God's co-workers and part of the whole, without one being extra special. So notice Paul's metaphor. He tells the church in Corinth that they together are God's field and God's building.
Mm-hmm. Well, did you know that this idea of God's people as building or a temple wasn't completely unique? The writer of our lesson points out that the Qumran community of Essenes, that is, if you remember the place where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, this would have been the community of the Essenes. They saw themselves as a temple in waiting until God would destroy the current corrupt temple system. So they emphasized priestly law-observing purity. So imagine then how they would respond to this group of Jews and Gentiles, these followers of Jesus. They would, pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, it sure was, because Jews and Gentiles weren't supposed to mix, and here Paul's saying this mixed group is God's temple. Well, Paul also challenges by his use of Hebrew scriptures, the ones that he includes. So in verse 20, he's going to quote from Psalm 24. And Psalm 24 addresses some socioeconomic injustices. In that psalm, it is talking to those who are arrogant. And in their arrogance, their actions are killing widows and immigrants and orphans. So that's the context of this psalm. And so verse 11, Paul quotes to address those who think they are wise. And he says, those who think they are wise are futile, as empty as a breath. Might
Paul then be addressing the economic strategies or the different ways that the system worked, because it enhanced the position of the rich and the social mobile person at the expense of the poor and vulnerable?
Well, you know, everything about the way of Jesus would have went against some of the cultural goals of the time, especially those of getting more wealth, more power, more prestige. So, in thinking about these different factions, what do you think was the difference between Apollos and Paul? It sounds like they're getting a lot of attention in these verses that we read today.
Well, I hear Paul telling us that those with Apollos might be arrogant. They might be puffed up, and we're not spiritual enough necessarily. There was also jealousy and fighting between these church factions. This tells me that as Paul said, you continue to live by human standards, but don't know how to act in a spiritual way with each other. It's like that milk, giving them milk instead of solid food. When someone says, I belong to Paul, and someone says, I belong to Apollos, aren't you acting like people without a spirit? And after all, what is Apollos? What is Paul?
So, although Paul here is calling out some of this kind of puffed up behavior of those who are following Apollos, he also kind of identifies himself with Apollos. So how might it sounded to those who said, I am of Paul, when hearing him sort of compliment or commend Apollos?
Yeah, so there again, Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, God made it grow. Verse 7, he says, because of this, neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but the only one who is anything is God, who makes it grow. Think of Paul and Apollos as table waiters, as servants through whom you believed. So in comparison, they're not honored guests. They're not the head of the table. They're not the owners of the house. They're not even the makers of the food. They are table waiters. Hello, my name is Apollos. I'll be serving you tonight. What would you like to start with? Something to drink? So I think we need to adjust our thinking and be careful not to put Paul and Apollos in the wrong place. So today, Audrey, how do leaders of different churches and denominations work together rather than in competition with each other?
Yeah, I think sometimes as church leaders, we can tend to compare ourselves. And sometimes that leads to a bit of competition of like who's doing it better. But I found when I was pastoring a church in Pequea Township, the pandemic radically changed things. It changed a lot of things about the way we did life, but I think it also changed the relationship between those local pastors. One of those pastors sort of set up this Zoom group of 4 to 5 different denominations. We were different sized churches. Even some of our areas overlapped, but it was so important for us to get together and say, oh my goodness, what are you doing? Here's some ideas that we've practiced, just to be there to support each other. And then even after the pandemic, we found that those relationships were so valuable that we kept meeting even then in person. And, we talked about more things than just the pandemic after that. And it became a really supportive group. But there is sort of a turning point. At one point, he was actually not a pastor, but a leader of a local ministry, said to the group, it should matter to us if one of our churches or any church in that area is struggling. It should matter to us if they would feel like they have to close down or if they're going through a rough time. That should be our concern too, rather than this spirit of competition or territorial way that a lot of churches feel about each other, especially the ones close by.
Yeah, so that was meaningful for you.
So meaningful. So, looking at that next section, those who would say, I belong to Christ, I'm curious how it might have felt to them to sort of overhear this conversation about wisdom versus foolishness.
Yeah. So this group might have been surprised that Paul thought of himself and Apollos as being publicly shamed. Paul in 1 Corinthians 4, 9 to 13, let me read that here. It says, I suppose that God has shown that we are apostles are at the end of the line, that we are like prisoners sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle in the world, both to angels and to humans. We are fools for Christ, but we are wise through Christ. We are weak, but we are strong. You are honored, but we are dishonored. Up to this very moment, we were hungry, thirsty, wearing rags, abused, and homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are insulted, we respond with a blessing. When we are harassed, we put up with it. When our reputation is attacked, we are encouraging. We have become the scum of the earth, the waste that runs off everything up to the present time. So those for Christ, they knew what it meant to be homeless. They knew what it meant to be discarded, what it felt like to be scum. And in hearing this, I wonder if they thought Paul was maybe out of touch with what really was the meaning of being an outcast.
Yeah, I'm sure Paul felt like they went through rough times, and they did. They did go through rough times, but I think it's also important for us as leaders to think about how our words might sound to the people who are listening. So I'm wondering, in all of the sermons that you have preached over the years, how did you think about the words you chose or the illustrations you chose and how that might sound to the people who are listening to you?
Yeah, so, I grew a lot in my preaching. And as a few newer people would start coming to church, some of them had been unchurched or haven't been in church for a long time, I started to think about them and how I spoke. So when I prepared a sermon, what language was I using? Was it theological terms, or was it more down-to-earth terms? I thought it was important for them to be able to understand in everyday language. Mm-hmm. It might be like moving from the King James Version of the Bible to using the New Living Testament or the Common English Bible.
Words that they might connect with or use in their everyday life.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, those who belonged to Cephas, they had some Jewish background, and, talking about this whole thing of wisdom had a rich tradition in Jewish literature and things. They also had a pretty precarious situation in Rome. I mean, they might have been thinking, am I going to be kicked out? Like a lot of them already had been kicked out of the empire. And so, their situation was a little precarious. And when I think about, how did they think of belonging? Could they belong in this group? And it must have been encouraging to hear, you are God's field together. You are a part of God's building together. But Paul also says, take it on the chin a little bit. I wonder if that was a little bit hard to hear as well. When somebody insults you, when we're insulted, we put up with it. When our reputation is attacked, we're encouraging. I wonder if they thought at times, hey, stand up for yourself a bit. Yeah. Those are hard conversations, hard things to work through.
Yeah, for sure.
I think part of what Paul is saying in all of this is to step into each other's shoes a bit and to see each other, instead of being rivals, as co-workers. And we all come at this with a different set of skills, with different roles that we play, but it's all a part of God's kingdom. Like we were talking about, all of those different tools going into building these new buildings on our campus. But the goal is the building at the end. And as we work together, different leaders, different styles, different denominations, different ways of praising God, in the end, we are all working toward the kingdom of God. But sometimes it's not easy to see from another's point of view.
Yeah, sounds like the song we sang at camp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to close by reading the lyrics to this song, Jesus, Help Us Live in Peace. Jesus, help us live in peace. From our blindness, set us free. Fill us with your healing love. Help us live in unity. Many times we don't agree on what's right or wrong to do. It's so hard to really see from another's point of view. How we long for power and fame, seeking every earthly thing. We forget the one who came as a servant, not a king. So Jesus, help us live in peace. From our blindness, set us free. Fill us with your healing love. Help us live in unity.